everybody. We're delighted to have you with us today. My name is Andy Gaines. I'm the Executive Director of Ashby Village. Ashby Village is a community-based nonprofit organization that hosts events like this. We connect people with one another, offering support and opportunities for meaningful engagement that enable us to age with a sense of belonging and dignity. Together, we in our community are transforming how we age in the East Bay. So grateful to have you. Today's event is a production of the Ashby Village Arts and Culture series. It began in 2017, offering food for thought for members in the broad community. We're drawing upon our members of our community, older adults, and people we have connection with who we believe will really inspire all of us. So thanks for joining us. I wanted you to know Ashby Village is doing great in this time of COVID, but we're more and more of our events are virtual. And while these events are free for anyone to attend, including our members, Ashby Village relies on donations in order to bring programs such as this to our members and friends. So I want to bring your attention to the chat box where we placed a link as a simple way for you to make a donation. You can just go to our website at any time if you don't have this link and just donate as a support for what we're doing. So thanks so much for that. Following the presentation and the conversation today, we'll have time for questions and answers. You can put your questions and comments in the chat box. And following the event, Sigrid Duesdorf, who is head of our events team, will be hosting the fielding and presenting your questions. So I'd like to now pass it over to Peter Sussman, who's an Ashby Village member and volunteer and husband of one of our co-founders. He's been with us since the get-go, and he'll introduce Diane and Daniel. Thanks, Peter. Take it away.
Thanks, Cindy, and good afternoon. I'm the one introducing our speaker today because for me, this is personal. It started when my widowed elderly mother one day called to inform me that she had been vigorously pursued for the previous week by a man named Bernie. 1 week later, she called to say that Bernie had moved in and they later married. My stepfather was a quirky character who, moments after I was introduced to him in person, asked me what I had done that day to end nuclear war. He relished having me in his family primarily because I was a writer to whom he could send the stories his precocious young grandson had written. Bernie was exceptionally proud of his preteen grandson, and I subsequently became close to that grandson and his family who live in Palo Alto. Today, it is my privilege to introduce you to Daniel Mason, Bernie's grandson, and to do what my late-in-life stepfather devoutly wished, which is to spread the word about this enormously talented man whose books I have followed since his very first one, entitled, "And Grandpa Told Me About the Time He Went to Prison." Mm-hmm. That book doesn't even get a mention on Daniel's website, but his subsequent novels and stories have been internationally acclaimed, beginning with The Piano Tuner in 2002. Set in remote jungles of colonial India and Burma in 1886, The Piano Tuner was published when Daniel was 26 and was the basis later of an opera of the same name. It has been translated into 28 languages and has been compared with Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. The Piano Tuner, like all of Daniel's writing, was elegantly written and meticulously researched with firsthand immersion in its exotic natural environment. Daniel's fiction takes place in different eras and in locations off the beaten track around the globe, often occasioned by obscure historical anecdotes. Two other well-received novels, A Far Country in 2007 and The Winter Soldier in 2018, followed. And then a book of short stories, A Registry of My Passage Upon the Earth, was published this past year. Copies of that book and probably most of his others are available at Pegasus and at Mrs. Dalloway's in the neighborhood where he used to live. Daniel's short stories and essays have appeared in The Atlantic, Harper's, Zoetrope, and Lapham's Quarterly. During and in between all this writing, Daniel traveled to untamed corners of the world and completed medical school at UCSF. He is now an assistant professor at Stanford and a practicing psychiatrist. His research and teaching specialties include climate change and mental health, the literature of psychosis, and the influence of history and culture on the practice of medicine. In 2014, Daniel was the recipient of a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. He has also won the Northern California Book Award for Fiction and was the 2020 recipient of the Joyce Carol Oates Prize, presented by the Simpson Literary Project, a partnership of the UC Berkeley Department of English and the Lafayette Library and Learning Center Foundation. The Simpson Project fosters new literature and supports libraries, schools, readers, and writers of all generations, from beginners to established authors. Founding project chairman Joseph DePrisco has justified the mid-career prize that Daniel received by saying, "There are too damn many emerging writer prizes. What about emerged writers?" He said, 95% of publishers' catalogs are made up of writers in the middle of their careers. But unless you're J.K. Rowling or Stephen King, you're not on the bestseller lists. You need support. We are fortunate today to have Diane Del Signore interviewing Daniel. She's the executive director of the Simpson Literary Project. Diane has an MBA from Stanford and has served in managerial roles at Hewlett-Packard and other corporate and nonprofit organizations, including 10 years as executive director of a statewide nonprofit dedicated to sustainable agriculture, and she practices what she preaches. She's an urban farmer who raises goats, chickens, and rabbits. Diane has served on a number of nonprofit boards devoted to the arts, education, and community health. And with that, I turn it over to Diane and to Bernie's grandson, the fully emerged writer, Daniel Mason.
Thank you, Peter. Such a nice introduction. It is a pleasure to be here this afternoon with members and guests of Ashby Village. And I am thrilled to be in conversation with Daniel Mason. I can eliminate a lot of what I was going to say because Peter, you did such a lovely job of introducing both the project and the prize and Daniel. So we selected Daniel from a distinguished set of authors. And at that point, when we were when the jury was meeting and looking at all the authors a year ago, Daniel had most recently published The Winter Soldier. And for those of you who haven't, I'm just going to show up The Winter Soldier. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read this lovely novel, I suggest that when we're done our conversation today, you run, not walk, to your computer and order it from your favorite independent bookstore. It is truly a gripping story set in World War I on the Eastern Front, and it's about a medical student, excuse me, who gets thrown into a war hospital. Today, we're going to be discussing Daniel's collection of short fiction, which Peter mentioned. So it's this collection right here, A Registry of My Passage Upon the Earth. And I suggest you're going to want to add this to your book order as well. So I have a quote from Daniel where, Daniel, you said you find more joy in your short fiction than in the long form, and I'm looking forward to exploring that with you today. A good place, I think, to start our conversation is Daniel actually, between medical school at UCSF and then his residency at Stanford, I think he took off around 7 years, and not took off, he wasn't camping per se, but he was honing his craft of writing. And he was a fellow at the Townsend Center for Humanities on the Berkeley campus. And I know, Daniel, we quoted you in our press release last year where you said it was in Berkeley that many of the stories in Registry took form. So I would love to open up for you now, Daniel, to tell us about your time in Berkeley.
Sure. What a great question to start with. But let me just first thank I'm going to thank Irene and Sigrid and Suya and Andy and you, Diane, for having me. speak today, but then particularly Peter for that wonderful introduction. When Peter and his mom entered our family, I remember hearing in hushed tones of this near legendary writer and editor who is now a member of our family, a profession that I think at that time I actually didn't really imagine that real people actually did, and so Peter was really a very early model for me in thinking that writing was a job that one could have in one's life, and I could say that one of my prized memories of sort of early publication was a photograph that was taken when the Piano Tuner was released, and I went to New York, and I'm sort of a native Californian, and of course New York, no matter how many times I visited, always felt like the true proverbial big city for me, and especially that's true for a writer, of course, because our editors and agents are there, and so sort of the New York reading is a kind of special event that's infused with a certain amount of nerves, at least it was for me. And so I had this event in Union Square. Very nervous about who would be coming and how I would sort of conduct myself. And I did the reading. Sort of nervously, fortunately, nothing too embarrassing happened. And when it came then for the line of people who wanted their books signed, at the very front of the line with my editors and my agents waiting in line, behind her was Peter's mom, who came up and very forcefully just grabbed me by the head and planted an enormous kiss on my cheek. And so one of my cherished photographs is this occurring with the literati lined up behind her. So it's wonderful to be here on Zoom with you, and to talk about Berkeley. So I arrived in Berkeley, I think it was probably 2004, and I had graduated from medical school the year before, and Piano Tuner had come out while I was in medical school, and I had gone back and forth about whether or not I was going to keep practicing or write, and I would sort of take off for blocks at a time to write, but then eventually graduation came, and I decided that I was in the middle of a far country, and I thought before I start residency, I'm going to see what it's like to actually be a writer and be able to devote myself to this a little bit more time than I had before, and so I didn't sort of know where a writer went in the world, but Berkeley presented itself, this sort of the land of the person with the laptop in their bag, wandering from cafe to library to spot in the woods, and I ended up. I think fortunately that step probably would have been a little bit overwhelming for me to take on my own, but I had a fellowship with the Townsend Center at Berkeley, both in the English department and then the Spanish and Portuguese department, because my book was set in Brazil, and I'd come to know faculty there, specifically Candace Slater, who was faculty there, and books I admired, and so I ended up coming to Berkeley for a couple of months for the Townsend Fellowship, maybe even just a month now. But then I think, like a lot of people who come to Berkeley, staying, and so then it ended up being for the next, I have to count, but I'm going to guess 6 or 7 years. I kind of haunted the streets around Ashby Avenue, around College Avenue, sort of walking back and forth between the cafes and spending much of my time writing there.
Nice. So I think the best way for us to really get a sense of this collection is to dive into some of the stories. And the first one I'm going to suggest is, it's called The Second Doctor's Service. And the main character, Dr. Service, is afflicted with what we are led to believe is epilepsy. And interestingly, after he has a seizure, he develops this alternate personality. And then when he's embodying that person, he seems to be better at everything. He's a better lover. He's a better raconteur. He's a better hunter when he's out with his brother. And so I'm interested what to make of this, Daniel. I'm interested to hear you talk about it. And then I also asked Daniel if he'd read from the collection. So page 82. Sure.
So I'll start with that. So yeah, like you mentioned, Diane, about half of these books were written in Berkeley, and I can even remember writing much of the second story, The Ecstasy of Alfred Russel Wallace, for instance. I opened the table of contents here, was written at Cafe Roma. I think it's been a long time, so I don't want to mess up my cafes, but I believe Cafe Roma on Ashby in College, right? So sitting there, and Death is Pugilist, the first story, I primarily used as my source a series of old books about early 19th century boxing that at the time sort of astoundingly could be checked out from the UC Berkeley libraries. Since then, because I sort of have an affection for these stories, I wanted to see if I could buy myself my own copy of these books called like Pugilistica or the Fanciana, sort of a reference to the people who are interested in bare knuckle fighting. And I've gone on, I still have alerts on my email for these books when they show up on all used books websites. They're extraordinarily expensive, and yet somehow the Berkeley Library let me walk out the door with a number of these volumes, which I really actually couldn't even afford right now. So, but I can remember working in the stacks on that story, and a number of other ones here. Second Doctor Service I wrote once I'd become a psychiatrist, or I guess during my training becoming a psychiatrist. And it was inspired by some reading that I had done about this interest in the 19th century in people who suddenly changed. And of course, this was sort of before there were adequate tools to assess epilepsy, before there was a system of classification that described conditions like bipolar disorder. Epilepsy and bipolar being understood as two very different entities now. And yet, in the late 19th century, there wasn't a kind of clear division. And what was important was this phenomenon of the sudden change. Sleepwalking was another condition that was sort of thought of under this broader phenomenon of the person who underwent a sudden change. And there's a couple wonderful case reports in the medical literature from this time, one of which suggested a man who was not that changed during one of his seizures, and that then inspired and this story. So I'll read to you. You want on page 82, right? Just to the top of 83.
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay, so this is describing, the story begins, it's in the form of a letter to a medical, to a medical magazine, to a professional magazine, written by a doctor as a request to other members of the society for help, for explanation of what's going on with this new clinical situation that he finds himself in. Unlike with most illnesses, sirs, which arise within us insidiously, creeping through vein and fiber, unsettling our slumber, gradually awakening within us that ineffable, horrific sense of dis-ease, it is possible to state the very instant, indeed the very longitude and latitude of my affliction, being 4 strokes after 12 noon on August 24th, 1882, on the cusp of Mercy's Ridge, outside of S. I was returning from a sick call. The patient was a parson's son who had fallen ill with a tertian fever. I had attended him for 3 days and nights with a constant application of Bidham's ointment, and upon restoring him to health, had saddled my horse and began my journey home. It was a warm summer day, one of those particularly gilded morrows when the air swarms with motes of pollen and the scent of wet grass rises from the fields, and everywhere life appears to swirl in such a miasma that I have wondered since if I did not inhale some invisible animalcule as I galloped up the hill, and that it is perhaps upon this beastie that I should lay the blame for all that followed. Down in the valley, the noon bells had tolled thrice, when there arose a very strong odor of chestnuts, overwhelming the sweet scent of grass, and the sharp bloom of all the goldenrods stirred up by my horse's feet. This was impossible, of course. Chestnuts would not be in season until November, and this thought, delivered whole and instantaneously between the third and fourth tolling of the bells, seemed to carry on its wings the conviction that something odd and terrible was to occur. It was then, just as I crested the hill, expecting the spectacular vision of the forests below, that I found myself not before that view, but somehow 5 miles farther, thundering over the bridge at Wilson's Mill.
Thank you. So Daniel, also, would you be able to read the next paragraph?
Oh, sure. Keep going.
I picked out 3 words in the next paragraph I really want to talk about.
Sure, no, sure.
Thank
all right.
you.
We're on the bridge at Wilson's Mill. We are all accustomed, I believe, to the experience of traveling and drifting into distraction, only to arrive safely at our destination as if directed by some unseen hand. My first suspicion was that this was what had happened, and yet I also know it wasn't so. I had passed along this road 1,000 times, and not once had I failed to stop on its descent into that ancient forest of beech and linden, where the soft light filters down through the whispering leaves, and the air is filled with the gay tintinnabulation of the chickadees, and the odor of the mushrooms and mosses never fails to awaken in me a profound nostalgia for my childhood adventures amidst those cathedrals of fallen boughs. Nor, I knew, could I have fallen asleep, for the road is too perilous, with hanging limbs that can dispatch even the most alert traveler. Such is my reasoning in retrospect. At the time, it was a particular sensation that told me something was different, a feeling, unlike any other I had experienced, of complete nothingness, as if an ellipsis had occurred between the fields of goldenrod on Mercy's Ridge and the linden depths of the mill, as if time and distance had somehow folded upon themselves, or, to put it differently, as if I had simply ceased to be.
So, that's so beautiful. So I was hoping to hear you talk about, I mean, these are some of the most beautiful sentences to me in the whole book. And the book is full of beautiful sentences. And I was hoping you might talk about your choice of ellipsis and folded in that last sentence.
Oh, wow. So great questions. Great questions. And I have to say, if anyone who's listening has friends who are writers, this kind of question to ask why one chose a word can really get you kind of an earful. So it's a wonderful question and one that we're rarely asked. So ellipsis. And it's funny, as I was reading the first paragraph, I kept on waiting for the word ellipsis because I had remembered that. And so in some ways, in thinking about word choice, I think my answer is sort of on 2 levels. So first of all, there are times when I'm writing and certain words present themselves and they go onto the page. It's probably less interesting answer to the question. And then it's more in retrospect when I'm reading over that I decide whether or not something belongs and why it might belong there. I think that ellipsis, in this case, not only captures the experience that Dr. Service has and will continue to have throughout the story, but at the same time, I'm aware in writing this that this is a text, not only a story that could be heard if read aloud, but one seen on the page, where ellipsis as punctuation very much forms the very material by which a story is told. It's part of the structure, and so eventually what happens in the story is that we anytime we write a character, there's ellipsis in their life, and it's sort of the power, I think, that the storyteller has. I've just been reading Evelyn Waugh. I never read Brideshead Revisited, and I read this for the first time just recently, and I was just blown away by his use of ellipsis, and then as I was reading, and I thought, on some level, this is such a powerful tool, right? I mean, he's literally obliterating parts of the lives of the people that he is creating. He's turning them off, and then reanimating them to emerge upon the page. Where do they go during this time when he takes them away? The creator has sort of almost like a whimsical play with the created here, and so that's occurring. But then this is also occurring for this man who is suffering. Very unusual seizures, a kind of seizure that really, one doesn't see a seizure like this, but people who do experience seizures, and some other medical and psychiatric conditions have moments where they cease to exist. And so I was kind of interested about the phenomenology of non-existence. I mean, we all experience that to some degree when we sleep as well, whether we're both there and we're not. So I like that term. So a lowly element of punctuation actually takes on a kind of existential chord in this sense.
Beautiful.
Folded's a lovely word for you to pick. You said you had a couple of words. I thought you were going to pick tintinabulation, right? Because
that's the third word. So I actually want to talk about that.
Well, I mean, that's sort of that's more of the show-off word. I love interesting words, and I think one tension for me as a writer, and a place where I've made mistakes in the past, is there's times that I've picked words that are too obscure, and I've regretted that. Certainly, my second book has a couple of those that I was just thinking about lately. I wish I could change. Tintinabulation is not one. It's just because it's the ringing, and I mean it's a word that has incredible onomatopoetic qualities to it. But you mentioned folded, which is I think even more fun, because there's a simplicity to folded that I think again at the time was I thinking about this. I don't know, but what I like about it a lot is that it creates a kind of tension between the terror of what's going on in this man's life, and which will continue to progress. I mean, a true existential terror is given a word which we use to describe what we do to a piece of paper or an envelope or a newspaper. This is not a terrifying word. And yet for him, it's the most terrifying, because what's being folded is his consciousness, his existence. But I like it's the fact that this word that's seemingly so innocent can at the same time be something so terrible.
I think you really captured. I mean, I really felt like I had a sense of what he was experiencing with this seizure. And disappearing, and that end of that paragraph beautifully captures it. I want to touch on tintinabulation though for a minute, because you have the previous. So what you read is actually 2 paragraphs. And the first paragraph you talk about bells, and then the second paragraph you kind of get into what's happening, and you talk about tintinabulation. And so when I was reading this, it inspired me to dust off my old college volume of Edgar Allan Poe. So I was wondering, because the bells, his famous poem, do you know that poem, or were you connecting bells, even though you used tintinabulation with the chickadees? You sort of put them together in terms of his well-known or somewhat well-known poem, The Bells. So just curious if that occurred to you.
It's a wonderful association. It didn't. And actually now, as I look at it, and I think, I didn't even connect the chickadees to the bells in the paragraph beforehand. But I like it. It's great. I'm glad that it's there, because they kind of echo. And I mean, in some ways, we hear the bells go in the first paragraph, and then as he moves down the road away from the bells, that tintinabulation gets picked up then by the birds themselves.
Yeah, the chickadees.
Yeah,
That's how I experienced it.
Right.
So
That's great.
I think I want to move us into another story. I'm going to give you a choice. Do you want to talk about the balloonist in On the Cause of Winds and Waves, or the line agent Pascal? Both wonderful.
I guess we could talk about the line agent Pascal. I don't know why I answer that, but
Well, I'm wondering if you selected that because I'll set it up just a little bit. It's about a French telegraph operator who maintains a solitary railway station in the Amazon. And Pascal's only relationships are with other line agents whom he's never met. And by the way, the story is only 20 pages, very tight, and it manages to convey a complete story. So I'm wondering if you selected it because it's a little bit reminiscent of the time we find ourselves in with the pandemic.
Yeah, maybe. It's certainly of the stories. I certainly imagine, like a lot of writers, find themselves wondering what about their work is relevant. Here's a 19th century story about a doctor. Like, what does that have to bear on what's going on in the world today? Here's a story about a telegraph operator in Amazon. What does that bear on the world today? And there are a couple stories that, as I wonder that question, there's a couple stories in the collection, I think, that do have more resonance for me, at least more resonance with the kind of content of the world today. And so this is a story that was originally inspired by a scene in Claude Lévi-Strauss's Tristes Tropiques, in which he mentions in passing these men who work on telegraph line that supports the railway through this very remote region of Brazil. And Brazil's already come up a couple times in this. My second book's based there, even though it's not named. I spent a very important part of my life traveling there. I think that a lot of my love of the natural world comes from experiences that I had there. I have a very close friend who's a botanist who's there. So a number of the stories are sort of Brazil based. I was reading a lot about Brazil when I was writing these. And so I was struck by these images of these men so distant from each other. And I had come back from traveling with this friend on this boat that went up the Amazon. It was just an extraordinary experience, not just because of sort of the beauty of the natural world that we saw, but also because the experience of distance was something that I never had on that kind of level, that we would travel for days and before the next town would appear, and then more days until the next time appeared. And I actually found that the isolation was both wonderful, but began to feel claustrophobic. And so then I come and I read these stories about these men, and I think, how did they do it? Like, a lot of these stories are driven by this question, like, how do they do it? How can they be this person that they are? And then so I wrote it, and I'm a person who I got a cell phone very late. I was probably the last person in my age group to understand what text message was. I've very reluctantly been on social media very briefly before sort of running in fear from it. So I am not kind of virtually very connected. But when I finished it, it did occur to me that these people who only know each other through the signals that they're sending along the telegraph line were in some ways prototypes for the kind of virtual relationship that many people have now. And that was pre-pandemic. And then the pandemic starts, and literally our only connection between you and me and every participant here right now is over a cable. So we're not too different from persons whose life initially seemed so exotic.
Well, speaking of the pandemic, I guess I'm curious if you see any surprising silver linings with respect to your patients or your students, given what we mainly regard as a really awful time in our world.
Well, so at the beginning, I certainly had hoped that there would be more silver linings. I remember sort of in February, March, when this started out, there was at least this, I think maybe quieter second narrative that for instance, this would represent an opportunity for certain kinds of structural change, structural economic change, that we have an unsustainable economic system environmentally, and perhaps this would represent a moment where we could break with that. Where I would go out and see families together who I'd never seen together beforehand. I think that this also kind of gave me a certain kind of hope. I know it certainly forced me to kind of slow down and reassess what I wanted to be doing. So it felt like there were the possibilities of some silver linings there. And I think that it refocused, I think, a lot of people I know on what they felt was important. Again, all silver linings against the backdrop of, against the backdrop of something so terrible. I think as time has gone on, those have begun to break apart, and this sort of sheer exhaustion of the isolation, the fact that there doesn't seem to have been the kind of structural change maybe people would have hoped for. That in some ways the elements of isolation, mechanization, the concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer people has only sort of accelerated. And so, at the beginning, I was more hopeful, I guess, than I sort of am now. But at the same time, I'm also aware that that this kind of pessimism comes at the time of, in the midst of a dark political period, but certainly, hopefully, at the tail end of a very stressful period of time. I think that it's interesting. So reading War, actually reading some James Herriot lately, and listening to the kind of communal engagement with the war that occurs. Of course, these are different sorts of stories in a different sort of time, but it does make me think that if we had had different leadership during the pandemic, then some of those kinds of silver linings actually would have borne fruit, and we'd be working together a bit more than it feels like right now. And I could say right now, my students. I think the connection from a distance is interesting. In all my classes, I have the students send photographs of where they are. I always find that sort of exciting, like just kind of marvel at the size of the world. And I know I've heard among patients, then friends and students that, and this goes back to maybe what I was saying at the start, that, quite a number of people who sort of, saw themselves as dissenters from modern culture, who were not happy about the way things were going, did feel like, for them at least, the experience of shared hardship was,
yeah, it's interesting.
Was strengthening. So that's been kind of striking to me, is how differential the effects of the experience have been.
Well, so I'm curious, based on what you're saying, I know when we interviewed you, when you got the prize almost a year ago, 10 months ago, you had talked about, you were thinking, if I interpret a quote from our press release properly, that although known for your historical fiction, you were planning to maybe shift a bit more into the current time and write more about California. And so I'm wondering now, given the last 10 months or so, like I know writers are often don't want to talk about what they're working on, so you can, draw the boundary, but I'm curious if in 10 months, given our current situation, if you're shifting what you want to work on.
Sure. Well, so I just had a story coming. I don't know if it's been hit the presses yet. I think it has. So Zoetrope, which is this wonderful literary magazine published in the Bay Area that I've been publishing for a few years now. Who actually, this line agent story that we began to talk about first came out in Zoetrope. So I just had a story come out in Zoetrope called The Wolves of Circassia, which is the story of a thrown together family during the pandemic. So I think that's probably the most modern story I've ever written. And it's one of a few. It's a moving target. So actually a couple of the stories I finished, then I put aside because life is what it is. And then I realized that either the history that I imagined might happen has come and happened, and so the story loses some tension, or it hasn't happened. So, but this story at least made it to the finish line. And so I think what's interesting, one of the more interesting aspects of all this is like the different kinds of social experience that the pandemic is creating. And so this is something that, I mean, continues to happen, but all of a sudden people are thrown together who hadn't expected to be thrown together. And it's like particularly true of families where older children are coming home and living with parents, couples who were not getting along all of a sudden find themselves in close quarters. And so the story is about an elderly couple who live out in Walnut Creek. The man has pretty advanced dementia, and he has a caretaker who is really sort of like a wonderful caretaker. And she's from Tonga, and actually based on kind of a wonderful caretaker that I know. And his son divorces from his wife and brings his grandson to live with the family out in Walnut Creek. And so they have this strange thrown together household. The son, who's sort of like a pretty busy lawyer, the grandson who sort of has a lot of attentional problems, and then particularly the grandfather with his dementia sort of become this unexpected threesome, and the way they interact and get to know each other and forms the basis of the story. So in that sense, I mean, I don't want to say, in medicine there's a line, you never want to be an interesting patient, and I feel that's probably true of writing. Like, you never really want to be in a world that somebody wants to write about. So there's something that feels like voyeuristic or almost sort of slightly sadistic to put these characters into these situations. So I wish they weren't in that situation, but one aspect of, I think, that's interesting to me in all of this is what it's revealed of us.
Yes.
That maybe wouldn't have been revealed if we hadn't been thrust into such a changed world.
So it sounds as if you are continuing with the short fiction now.
Yeah.
And so we were talking about that, and I wonder, do you feel like there's a different audience? And I want to ask you or make a comment about that, because I know in my just growing to where I am now, it seems that a number of people who enjoy fiction will comment that, oh, I don't really like short fiction. And I'm curious if you see, I mean, I know your book tour got truncated, really barely got to start when the pandemic came down. So I don't know if you have a sense with your short fiction versus your long form. And then I want to tell you about Audible. I have about a review on Audible of one of your books. But so anyhow, short fiction, long fiction. So it sounds, and then we started off the conversation from a quote where you said you get more joy from short fiction at this point.
You're right. So I wonder about this, because certainly within the publishing world, when you say you're writing a book of short fiction, like an editor, an agent will kind of, all of a sudden you look at you with this sort of face of concern, because I think there's this general feeling that people don't read it, they don't sell. I mean, there are many of examples to the contrary. So Joyce Carol Oates being one great exemplar of this, people who really have created incredible short fiction as work that is not just the collection of fiction that gets published between two novels, which I think sometimes the way the publishing industry treats it. But no, I do hear that from readers. I love writing the short fiction, I think, because I think I'm fascinated by some of the weirder corners of the English language, or maybe experience, and it gives me a chance to explore in one book English from 19th century boxing magazines, or fake translations of French ballooning expeditions, or one of the stories at the end is based on what would possibly be embroideries of a man who's in a psychiatric asylum. And so it's hard to imagine sustaining that over the length of a novel.
Mhm.
And so, so the structure of the novel makes that kind of interest a little bit more difficult to kind of bear to fruition. So, that said, I guess since writing this, I've come to read short fiction a little bit differently. Like I used to always, there's a Best American. There was the
Right.
what was published in the New Yorker. Or there was selected short fiction of so and so. So I'd pick it up and I'd read one or two of them. If I didn't like one when I started, I'd go pick another one. And after writing this, I've come to see these books of short fiction as something very different. That that one can actually attempt to tell a story over the arc of a number of stories, which hopefully build upon each other. And so I couldn't get away with calling this collection a novel. No one would let me do that. But I don't see the works as atomized. I have stories that were not placed here because they didn't belong, and the order that they occur in has sort of importance to me as well. So after doing that, I've come to read short fiction very differently. Like I read it from beginning to end, and I'll read a book of short fiction as opposed to collected stories or selected stories, because I've come to see them a little bit more as coherent projects.
Yes, I want to bring in another angle. So I had the pleasure of also both first listening to your short story collection on Audible as I walked the neighborhood, and then I read them. And I think there are like 5 actors that read these 9 stories. Have you had a chance to listen to the Audible version or the audio version?
I have, yeah. It was great. So they sent me voices, and they allowed me to be part of choosing who does the reading. And so they'd send me these voices, and so I get to listen to different people's take on what the story sound like, which of course then becomes strange because I'm wondering, am I trying to find someone who's reading it like the way I imagined it, or am I trying to find someone who adds a performative aspect and actually creates something different? But yeah, no, I think they're wonderful.
Yeah, they definitely popped. I mean, I felt like the woman who read the fake French ballooning expedition, her French accent really added to the mise en scène being there. And then listening to the final scene in the boxing story, the first story was just like a nail biter listening to it on Audible. So I don't know if you saw there was one review, John from Texas said, I normally hate short stories, but this guy is a wizard with words. So I found that to be, I thought that was kind of recruiting people to the short story form.
That's great. Thank you, John from Texas.
Exactly.
I have, I love, so I don't like particularly reading. There probably exists some, superhuman writer who doesn't read their reviews. So I haven't met him yet. So I don't like reading, but I love reading Amazon reviews. Just as a genre, I find them just hilarious. And I'll end up going down a rabbit hole, and it's just fascinating to see how people use the forum to register sort of broad objections to contemporary life. It's just this is wonderful. Not wonderful for the writer who happens to have some of the dissents registered on their book, but I also love the empowerment. This is something that so with my students, I really tried to move away from, back in the olden days, we used to have check plus, check minuses.
Right.
And I wish we had that, but they make me, our computer system for grading makes me give numbers, and I can't stand giving numbers. And so I try to find a way around this, but in explaining this to my students, I take them to the Goodread page for Madame Bovary, where she's given Flaubert is given a 3.7. And so I always thought, like, I just love it's so horrific on one hand, but at the same time, it's like the incredible chutzpah that
right, exactly.
or the democratizing experience that just, a person can give a 2 to Madame Bovary, and, therefore register their disapproval
Yes.
for the world to know, to have such a sort of final word, at least in this form. Anyway, but that's funny. I'm glad John of Texas was civil.
Yeah, you're a wizard. So I noticed we're coming up on the hour. So I wanted to know if there's anything. I have so many additional stories I wanted you to talk about and questions, but is there something you want to make sure we talk about before we jump into Q&A? Is there a particular story or something about your class? There's so many topics.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's not a coincidence that we're talking. We haven't talked too much about the Joyce Carol Oates Prize or the Simpson Literary Project. I don't know if you want to talk about it at the end, or if you had a word to say, or if I can have a chance to speak about it.
I felt like Peter did a great intro, so I really appreciate that. And I know I'll just make a comment or two. As he said, it was co-founded with UC Berkeley, the English department, which is considered by many to be the premier English department in the country. And we work with PhD candidates in the department who are Simpson Fellows and who lead creative writing workshops after school with high schoolers, and predominantly youth that are at risk and youth that will go on to be the first in their families to go to college. And something that we're really proud of, and I think is turning out to be quite successful, is we publish an anthology every year. Here's Simpsonistas 1 and 2. And what's interesting about that is we have our successful mid-career writers such as yourself, shortlisted writers, Joyce Carol Oates, and alongside these teens who are in the workshops. And it's a really big deal for them to be published. And in some cases, I would suggest modestly that it's life-changing. So that's, I guess, something I want to put out. We feel like that's been a really important part of our project. So right now the jury is, we have 29 authors on the long list. They're working hard to read the work of those 29 authors. We'll be announcing the short list in March. And it's been a pleasure working with you. And as you know, the way we sort on the author that we select is both literary talent and, of course, what's been published. And then also somebody who wants to interact with the community and do a residency where you would go to Berkeley and teach workshops, and then also teach workshops with the teens and be in lots of venues with people in the community. And we're just not sure how that's going to take form this spring with the vaccine situation. So I don't know. As you know, we're trying to figure out what will that residency look like with Daniel Mason.
No, and I'll add that I think one of the pleasures of getting the honor is getting to know about the organization, and at the same time that's quite bittersweet because had it been another time, there's all this wonderful programming I think that regularly takes place in the community each year. So
yes,
but you know, that's of many things that have been changed because of
yes, exactly. So here we are in Zoom. So Siggy, should we turn it over to you?
I mean, actually, first of all, thank you very much so far for this really wonderful conversation that the two of you had. It was really fun. I mean, it was interesting, it was fun. And I mean, I actually just started to read this collection, you know, your book, Daniel, and I can't wait to continue now. I mean, it's even more interesting now for me to continue to read it. But we have actually right now, we don't really have question. I mean, we have one question here from Teresa. She asks, your reading of the doctor's experience sounded very much like a dissociative experience. Did you have that in mind when you wrote the passage?
Right. So that's a great question. So dissociation would be another one of those sudden change condition. And I think that, so it would just fascinated me, and you know, it's possible, I don't know if the person who asked the question has a medical background or psychological background, but it fascinates me to think about this time in medicine, which really is not so long ago, when, you know, really we know very little about what we're we're seeing. And I mean, I think back at some of the oldest forms of books on medical classification, where, for instance, rabies is classified next to anorexia nervosa, because in rabies, a person can't swallow water, so there's a kind of hydrophobia that's described. And so you can sort of understand that if you're going to classify these illnesses based on, the fundamental element of this condition is that the person is refusing water, is refusing food, maybe we should be thinking of them as somehow related or neighborly. Again, not necessarily thinking about what causes them, because that the creators of that classification system weren't concerned with that, but nevertheless, purely based on appearances, if we step back from our classification system down the way, and we break down diseases into different kinds of categories, just on the surface, a lot of things look pretty similar. So dissociation, certain kinds of seizures, a psychiatric condition like bipolar disorder, and particularly severe cycling bipolar disorder. There are different kinds of dissociation, which the late 19th century was really, really fascinated with. All of this, say to the uninitiated, looks very similar, and I actually think that there's a lot of wisdom in that uninitiated perspective. So I was very much thinking about it. The doctor doesn't know what's going on, and in the story, he goes through what in medicine we would call a differential, the possible conditions that it could be. He says, I've heard of conditions like this, but none exactly like this. How could this actually be that when I disappear, someone else appears sort of in my place and carries on their own. So long answer to your question. Dissociation certainly would have been a concern.
I think there is one question that actually also refers back to this first question. Sally Ann says, it reminds me of Oliver Sacks' hallucinations. Any response?
Yeah, so I think that, it's different. I wonder, for instance, I wonder about this all the time, what the role of fiction has in talking about any of these experiences. So there certainly are definitive medical explorations of a lot of these experiences. And so I'm asking myself constantly, like, why fiction? What would fiction do here? And what would fiction add? And of course, there's the risk here. I'm presenting something as experience, which doesn't actually really happen that way. But I think a reader understands that. And I have the disclaimer that it's fiction at the start of the book, of course. But I think that my concern, which is probably, I'd say probably different from Sacks. I certainly haven't read all of Sacks, but my concern in writing fiction is much less sort of what happens, but what the experience in the inner life of the person who experiences that is like. And so this is an invented condition that the story explains, but my concern is, what would it be like for this person? And I think by extension, I hope that, in essence, this is a story about a person who has an illness that's not recognized by other people. That's a universal condition. That's far from something that's isolated into my story. Somebody who notices that they're changing and other people like the change, but they don't like the change. Again, something that extends beyond the bounds of the story. And so the goal of the story then is to explain what is that experience like? What is the internal world of the person who's going through that? That's much more the goal of fiction. Whereas I think Sacks is much more of a cataloger. I think he's very good, and I rely on his books for their sources all the time. He's encyclopedic in his ability to comb the medical literature, but I think his concern is a little different than fiction writers.
Okay, so we now actually have quite a few more questions trickling in. The next question was, can you tell us how you assembled the story about Brazilian self-taught artist Arthur Bispo de Rosario, who created a registry for God out of resplendent assemblages of casts of objects and embroideries during his 50 years in a psychiatric institution?
Sure, absolutely. Let me just see if I have a... This was not planned. Okay. This was not planned, but since so many books in my house are about Arthur Bispo, this is not hard to do. So Arthur Bispo, for those of you who haven't heard of him, or those of you who didn't read the last story in the collection, which is the title story in the collection. So he was originally from the northeast of Brazil, and he was a man who at some point, probably in his 20s, began to experience hallucinations and delusions, and ended up being taken to an asylum on the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro, where he spent a good portion of his life. Interesting, actually spent it was a much more porous institution than we tend to imagine asylums to be. So he came and went a bit, but spent most of his life there. And while he was there, he heard voices saying that he had been chosen by God to create a registry, a representation of what life on earth was like, to be presented to God on Judgment Day. And this drove him. He was never had any formal artistic training, but drove him to create over 1,000 pieces of either collage or embroideries that were intended to represent to God on Judgment Day what life was like, or what Bispo's experience had been like. And so some of these, I don't know how one can see. This is probably not the best example. Let's see. So this is nice. So this is a panel that he created out of shoes that he found on the asylum grounds. Here's sort of car parts that he's found on asylum grounds. So he's many of these, and then a lot of them involved embroidery. So here's a little merry-go-round that he created. This is all embroidered. And then there are these amazing sheets. So he was so driven by his mission that these are very small, so it's hard to see them, but essentially what they are is there's hospital bed sheets. You can still see on the bed sheets the name of the asylum stamped on the bed sheets. And he de-threaded his clothing, and he embroidered these incredible scenes. He probably learned embroidery from from someone in his family, probably a female member of his family in the Northeast where he was from before he went to Rio. So I guess the question was about the genesis of this story. When I was traveling around in Brazil, I happened to find myself in his hometown, this tiny little town called Japaratuba, in the state of Sergipe, and wandered into the cultural center there, which is just a room. And I don't even remember if they had other objects, but they had a poster of Bispo, who is a very striking man. He wore, let's see if I can find a picture of him. He wore this incredible outfit that he'd embroidered himself. And he reminded me a bit of a patient who I really loved back in San Francisco, a guy who had created a suit out of traffic signals that he had sort of picked off the street. He had this incredible outfit. And so I was, it caught my eye, and then I began reading about him. And I think at the time, I was drawn to not just his fantastic story, but also this idea that here is somebody whose experience is profoundly different from mine. And yet he's writing about this question of, he is driven to create for reasons that others don't understand, that calls into question why anyone would be driven to create. Like why bother doing any of this? Why write a book? If not to lots of reasons, but one of them might be if not to create some kind of registry of one's own experiences. So his voice felt like a wonderful way, I think, to explore those kinds of questions that I've been thinking about then. I really encourage anyone just to Google Arthur Bispo, because you can spend hours looking at his work.
Very good. So next question is actually a rather short question, I assume. When did you first start writing, as a kid or later in life?
As a kid, at the very beginning, Peter made reference to a couple of stories that I had written for my family back in high school. But I think even earlier than that, I wrote what wasn't called fan fiction then, but probably would call fan fiction now. Stories with Star Wars characters, that kind of.
Actually, Peter would like to know, I'd like to hear Daniel discuss the choice of topics for his novels and why, of all possible topics, he zeroed in on those.
Well, so I wish I knew. Not to sound sort of mystical about it or deliberately mystical or opaque about it. They tend to present themselves. So, there are many times that I want to write about something. I tend to write about something, but something else is what is the voice that comes into to my mind when I'm walking or falling asleep or just thinking, and so there's a certain kind of demand that at least now I've kind of come to recognize as being more necessary. When sort of summoning up the energy and I guess the courage to embark on any of these projects, which take so much time. Like it has to want to do it, as opposed to my, the many things that I'd like to write. The story has to want to go along.
Okay, so well, the next question is it has a couple of parts. So, any thoughts about how our human nervous systems and hearts are being changed by the ways children are grown up now? Will the shift to non-reading ways of absorbing information change how you might think of creating and communicating going forward? How keep bringing the past literary production into living forward into new generations?
That's a wonderful question. So I don't know. I wonder about this, and I'm one of the many people who sort of worry about the death of reading every time the death of reading is proclaimed. It hasn't seemed to happen. It's a pretty endurable form. Of course, certainly not timeless, right? I mean, for most of human history, we haven't been reading. It's pretty modern form of storytelling, but a pretty durable one, especially when we think about the competition for attention. Probably these numbers there, I'd be curious about the proportion of people who are readers today versus, say, the pre-internet era, the pre-YouTube era. I hope that I would actually be pleasantly surprised to learn that it's equal, that readers have not necessarily been lost. And I understand, again, I mean, this is not a scientific, I see these in sort of articles, so we're all probably reading the same articles. That, like, for instance, this was a very good year for reading. That at the beginning, I heard everyone thought this would be a great year for reading, and then people about halfway through the pandemic said, no, this is not the case. Everyone's just watching cats on YouTube. And then it turns out that actually, as the year has passed, that no, a lot of people have spent good quality slow time with books and come to recognize the pleasure of that, sort of the unique pleasures of that. So I'd like to think that sort of we as a collective artistic society have hit upon a pretty durable art form that's going to persist despite the kind of continued technological assaults. I don't want to be a Luddite. It's very possible that these are all wonderful forms of entertainment and communication and motivation and ways to capture human experience. Now, on a personal level, I don't know how to create in them, so I'll still just be writing. But it's heartening to see that writing, the poor written word, unadorned written word, seems to be able to hold its own against these other forms.
Before I continue, Daniel, I want to ask you, I mean, how many more questions are you still, I mean, want to answer? Because
Yeah.
there are actually quite a few still, you know, so I always ask that, you know, at one point. So,
Sure. I'm happy that they're wonderful questions.
I mean,
And you know, I've heard a lot about the community, and
that's
it
great.
sounds like there's some amazing people in the community probably who know much more about many of the topics that I'm sort of jabbering on about. So
I mean, that's,
I, you know, I'm honored by them. If it gets too late, we'll all.
just let me know. That,
Yeah.
okay, so the next question is, how does your work as a writer influence your work as a psychiatrist and vice versa?
So I'm still figuring that one out. As a psychiatrist, I found that it's cut both ways. You know, in some ways, it gives me. I thought it would maybe give me material. I mean, it gives me material like this 19th century story. I'm very reluctant to write about patients, and very uncomfortable writing about patients. Not to say that it shouldn't be done or can't be done. There are people who do it amazingly well with lots of respect, and I think create works that really contribute to mental health literature broadly. But I find it very hard. And actually, The Winter Soldier began as a book about a psychiatrist, and actually I felt so uncomfortable with that I felt like it was reflecting me, or my patients would think that it was meant to capture their experiences. That I really became liberated when I changed that and removed that from the book. So in some ways, my being a psychiatrist, I think, has in the balance, it's restricted a lot of what I feel like I can write about. You know, at the same time, like when I'm seeing patients, I am spending much of the day trying to figure out what's going on with them. But of course, that's not an activity that's limited to psychiatrists. I feel like the other direction, so from writing to psychiatry, is a little bit clearer to me. I feel that I do feel it's enriched my clinical practice in a lot of different ways. I mean, I think the first is that we're constantly trying to piece together a story of a patient's life. And I work in a university hospital, and so much of my time, probably more of my time, is spent actually hearing someone's story told to me by somebody else, a resident or a medical student, as opposed to, say, a patient telling me the story directly. And so I think writing has made me very conscious of what's missing in the story that's being told here. And so in this sort of the ritual that all the participants who come from the field of medicine are familiar with, where the case is presented beforehand, I'll often, I think much more since I've been writing, say, more about people's internal worlds, because I think my writing has shifted in that direction. I'm thinking as a resident telling me the story, like, how would I write this? I'm thinking like an editor. I'm imagining it like my editor would, my editor would say, I don't get why in The Winter Soldier, Lucius doesn't return to Margaret at this point. A similar sort of question. I don't get why, John said that he left his job and traveled across country. What's missing here? What part of the narrative is not there? And so, I feel that's a reflex from writing that's been quite helpful.
Okay, so our Ashby Village member Nancy just wanted to say, I just loved your presentation. Thank you so much. So that in between questions. Next question was, in what way did writing in Berkeley influence the content of your writing?
That's a great question. So I think, first of all, there's just the practical matter of having this wonderful university library there and be able to go through the stacks. I don't think that, like, the story of the boxer that begins the collection, I couldn't have written that without books that I found in the Berkeley Library. It just couldn't have been done. Amazingly, there actually are books out there in the world that one can't find on Google Books. And these old editions of boxing descriptions happen to be one. I also think I loved living in Berkeley, and I wish at times we could transplant Stanford to Berkeley, or make the distance a little bit closer. I think that there's a diversity of human experience in Berkeley that's pretty unparalleled. I mean, anywhere that I've lived. And so it was just quite, as a writer, you always want worlds to be bouncing off of you. I find I'm always looking for these kind of collisions that will jolt an idea. And they were just constantly happening in Berkeley, like whether the amount of times I would sit in Cafe Strada and just like listen to the person next to me at the table talking, and all of a sudden find myself in sort of this different space. And sometimes that person was like a conspiracy theorist, subspecies Berkeleyan, or maybe sometimes that person was a Nobel Prize winning professor, or maybe actually Nobel Prize winning conspiracy theorists. I also find those in Berkeley, or a student. There's just like this incredible mixture of kind of life that goes on there, with just enough natural beauty to keep that part of the world alive as well. So I think all of that shows up to some degree in most of the stories, and even the stories that have been written after I left.
Daniel, can you talk about the time you spent living in Burma and how the piano tuner comes out of that experience?
Sure. So this is a long time ago. In college, I had studied a certain kind of malaria infection, and I had gotten a scholarship after I graduated to live in Thailand for a year and work at a university there. And while I was there, it turned out that a lot of so Thailand then actually had much less malaria in the center of Thailand than on the Thai-Burmese border. The mosquito that carries it tends not to like dirty water. So I ended up working on the border, primarily with Burmese doctors and Burmese patients. And then after that, went back and did another research project actually in Burma itself. And so this was over, I guess, the course of 2 years. I spent about a year, maybe a year and a summer there. And then I come back, and this was the first time, not the first time I'd been abroad, but certainly the first time that I had been outside of the Americas or Western Europe. And I was 24 and quite struck by the experience. Really felt then, once I had returned to the West, thinking about how sort of many, even basic interactions that I was having were just strikingly different than those that I'd had over the course of the past year. And so I began to write first in first person, but I've always been very uncomfortable in the first person, unless it's like this imagined first person, like in the short story that I read from. And so I sort of quickly switched it to third person, and then I felt like contemporary America was not so interesting. Would it be possible to find another place to set this? And really, what I was thinking about, sort of the kind of deeper theme that I was interested in is this experience of finding oneself in a place so profoundly different from one's first home. And the colonial experience, I think, offered a grand setting for that, with all its complexities, and so it became rather quickly a story about a colonial Englishman traveling to more or less the same places.
Okay, I think, Daniel, we have 2 more questions left.
Sure.
So one is, Daniel, you spoke briefly about knowing you wanting to be a writer when you were quite young. Who encouraged you along the way to continue writing? Teachers, other kids who also like to write? When did you know you had to write?
Certainly my parents, and then teachers, family members like my grandfather, adopted family members like Peter. People who made it known that this was something that somebody could do. I think that the first like real impulse to do it, and the sense that I could write something more than a very short work, was really when I was in medical school, and this gap then opened up between these two experiences, and I think that the writing offered a chance to bridge that. I didn't have anybody to talk about my year with, and in some ways the book began as a way to talk about it. So, but the act of writing was something that various folks along the way supported.
Okay, so in fact, that was the last. No, one more question I have here. Okay, I was wanting to know the name of the story that was mentioned by, I want to say it was Peter doing the introduction. I really would like to know the name of that early story that Daniel wrote about his father, as I recall.
So yeah, it's something like my grandpa told me about the time he went to prison. So this is actually not the grandfather who married Peter's mom, but the other side of the family. And he went to prison not because he was a criminal, but because he was context probably important, but because he was captured by Russians during World War II. So that kind of prison.
So there's one comment, and I think that's a wonderful comment to finish the Q&A. Reading and movies get us through this day after day. Gotta go now, but this was great. I have to get your books. Thank you, your book. Thank you so much. So I think that's a nice way to finish the Q&A. And again, thank you very much, Daniel and Diane, of course. And now I give it back to Irene.
Okay. Thank you, Sigrid.
Hello, everybody. Hi, Daniel. Hello, Diane. And thank you so much for sharing your afternoon with us. We've been looking forward to this. There are many people in our community that you're fans, Daniel. And it was great to learn more about the Simpson Literary Project. So quite a wonderful afternoon. And everything that we look for at ANC, the Arts and Culture Group, to present. I wanted to remind people that two of the Pegasus bookstores committed to carrying the books, your books, Daniel, and the one on Solano Avenue and the one on Shattuck Avenue, and also Mrs. Dalloway's on College Avenue. And to give people a little bit of information about what we can look forward to for the next Arts and Culture presentation, on April 18th, Jonathan Simon, who is an associate dean and UC Berkeley at UC Berkeley School of Law, and a writer, is going to be talking to us about issues of his interest, and those are about crime and justice and mass incarceration in this country. So again, thank you so much, both of you, and enjoyed the afternoon, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about that tomorrow as we make our way through our day. And thanks from the members of the Arts and Culture Group. There are 5 of us that put together these presentations, and it is our pleasure to welcome our members and the community to these presentations. So have a wonderful rest of the afternoon, and thanks for being here.
Okay.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Diane.
Thanks so much, Irene. Thank you, Diane. Thanks, everybody.